I never imagined that Jack, my mom's new husband, would be the one to completely flip my world upside down. He was just there. Older than Mom by about 10 years, quiet, serious, and always polite in that distant, formal way. We barely interacted. I didn't care much for him, and he didn't seem to care much for me either. At least, that's what I thought. Until things changed. It started on a random afternoon. Mom was out late for work again, and the house was unusually quiet. I'd just come back from school, still in my casual clothes, when I got an idea: try on the new dress I'd ordered last week. A bit bold for my usual style, red, fitted, shorter than I expected. Not something Mom would ever approve of. But hey, no one was home, right? I slipped it on, adjusted the hem, checked myself out in the mirror, and that's when it happened. The door creaked open without a warning. I froze, heart pounding as Jack stood there, his hand still on the doorknob, staring at me. His eyes weren't just glancing, they lingered, trailing over me for a second too long. Long enough to make my skin tingle and my face flush. "Sorry," he mumbled, looking away awkwardly but not moving. "I thought you weren't home." I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively. "Jack. Not next time." I snapped, trying to sound angry, though my voice wavered with something I couldn't quite place. He didn't argue. Didn't explain himself. Just stood there for another uncomfortable second before finally closing the door and leaving. I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing. That was weird. Really weird. But I convinced myself it was nothing. Just an awkward moment. Happens, right? Except it didn't feel like just that. And what happened next only made things worse. For days, I tried to forget about it. Tried to act normal. But something had changed. I could feel it every time Jack was around. It wasn't just me imagining things, there was something in the way he looked at me now. Not constantly, not openly, but enough to notice. Enough to feel. The worst part? I started noticing him too. And I hated it. Every time we crossed paths in the hallway, I felt my heart pick up pace. Every shared glance across the dinner table made my skin prickle. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was just Jack. My mom's husband. Nothing more. But that one moment had planted a seed in my mind, and now it wouldn't go away. I caught myself thinking about it late at night, replaying the way his eyes had lingered on me. Wondering what he'd been thinking. And that's when it hit me: was he thinking about it too? Did he feel the same weird tension? The next incident happened when Mom was out late again. It was just me and Jack at home. I stayed in my room, hoping to avoid him entirely, but hunger eventually won out. I crept downstairs to grab something to eat, only to find him already in the kitchen. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but different. Softer, maybe? I couldn't tell. "Hey," I muttered, trying not to make eye contact as I rummaged through the fridge. I could feel him watching me. Every second of silence made the air heavier. I grabbed a bottle of water and turned to leave, but he spoke again. "About the other day." I froze. "Here we go." "I didn't mean to," he started, but I cut him off. "It's fine. Let's just forget about it, okay?" My voice came out harsher than I intended, but I needed to shut this down. Fast. He nodded slowly, but something in his eyes told me this wasn't over. And it wasn't. After that night, things only got more complicated. I'd catch him watching me out of the corner of his eye, and instead of looking away like I should, I'd meet his gaze. It became this unspoken game we played: who would break eye contact first. I started avoiding being alone with him. It felt safer that way. But the more I tried to avoid him, the more I felt like I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was maddening. One evening, Mom was out again, and I was curled up on the couch watching a movie. I heard Jack's footsteps approaching and stiffened, praying he'd just walk past. But no. He stopped in the doorway. "Mind if I join you?" he asked casually, but there was something beneath the surface of his voice. I should have said no. Should have made an excuse and left. But instead, I shrugged. Sure. He sat down beside me, too close. The movie played on, but I couldn't focus on it. All I could think about was how close he was. How I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. How my heart was racing for no reason at all. "EMS," he said quietly, using the nickname only my mom usually called me. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." I kept my eyes glued to the screen, afraid to look at him. "Do you ever feel different around me?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. I finally turned to look at him, my pulse thundering in my ears. What was he doing? Why was he asking me this? But more importantly, why didn't I stop him? "I don't know," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. There it was. The moment everything should have stopped. But it didn't. The following week, Mom was working late almost every night. That left me and Jack alone in the house. I tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore the tension in the air. It was subtle at first, just the way his eyes would linger a second too long or how he seemed to always be nearby whenever I turned around. And no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, my mind kept drifting back to that moment in my room. I hated that I couldn't forget it. Worse, I hated that some part of me didn't want to. One evening, as I sat curled up in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced up just in time to see Jack walking in. Without asking, he sat down on the couch beside me. Too close. The silence was deafening. I could feel his presence, every inch of space between us charged with something I couldn't describe. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, his voice low but calm. It sounded like a simple question, but the way he said it made my heart race. "Yeah. I'm fine," I replied quickly, my voice tighter than I intended. It was a lie, of course. Nothing felt fine. I was painfully aware of every breath he took, every slight movement he made. The air grew heavier with each passing second. I tried to focus on my book, but the words blurred together. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him glance at me again, and this time, I couldn't help but meet his gaze. Neither of us looked away. After that night, things only got more complicated. Every little interaction felt like a test, one I wasn't sure I wanted to pass or fail. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen making a snack when Jack walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching me. I tried to ignore him, but the silence stretched on until it became unbearable. "Need something?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out more defensive than I intended. "No," he said, but didn't move. He took a sip of his water, his eyes still fixed on me. "I just wanted to say that I didn't mean to make things weird between us." I froze for a second, not expecting that. "It's not weird," I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. "It's fine. Let's just not talk about it." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me that he wasn't convinced. And honestly, neither was I. As the days went by, the tension only grew worse. I found myself thinking about Jack more often than I wanted to admit. Every time we crossed paths, I felt my pulse quicken. Every shared glance was charged with an unspoken meaning I didn't want to acknowledge. And the worst part? I didn't hate it. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should have done everything in my power to avoid being alone with him. But a part of me didn't want to. A part of me was curious. About what, I wasn't sure. But the curiosity was there, gnawing at me every time he was near. One evening, Mom was out again, and I found myself in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. I heard Jack's footsteps approaching before I saw him. I braced myself, trying to act normal, But when he entered the room, the tension hit me like a wave. "Hey," he said quietly, standing at the doorway. "Hey," I replied without turning around, focusing on wiping down the counter. For a moment, there was only silence. I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my skin prickle. I tried to ignore it, tried to finish what I was doing as quickly as possible, but before I could, he spoke again. EMS, his voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "About what?" "About us." That word hung in the air between us, heavy and charged. Us. What did he mean by that? There wasn't an US. There couldn't be. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, trying to sound firm. "Whatever you're thinking, just don't." He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed up until I hit the counter. "I'm not thinking anything," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. "I just feel like things have been different lately. And I don't know how to make it go away." My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading, and, if I was honest with myself, anticipating. "You don't need to do anything," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We just pretend it never happened. That's it." But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't that simple. We couldn't pretend. Not anymore. "I can't," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you." Those last two words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was crazy, but I couldn't. Because the truth was, I'd been thinking about him too. More than I wanted to. More than I should have. "We can't do this," I whispered, though my resolve was slipping with every passing second. "It's wrong." "I know," he said, stepping even closer until there was barely any space between us. "But it doesn't change how I feel." I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay strong, to push him away. But when I opened them again, he was still there, watching me with that same intensity that made it impossible to think straight. For a moment, everything stood still. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us standing in that kitchen, caught in a tension we couldn't escape. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. If you thought this was intense, you won't believe what happens next. Trust me, it's only going to get crazier from here. Another week passed, and the tension between Jack and me reached its peak. We both tried to avoid each other, hoping that distance would somehow ease whatever strange connection had formed between us. But every attempt to stay apart only made things worse. The more I tried to ignore him, the more I found myself thinking about him, far more than I should. And every time we crossed paths, the tension felt unbearable. It wasn't just awkward glances anymore. There was something unspoken between us, something that neither of us dared to acknowledge out loud, but it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. That Friday night, Mom left for the weekend to visit her friend in another city. It was just me and Jack in the house, alone. I tried to stay in my room, thinking it was the safest place to be. I figured if I just kept to myself, nothing could happen. But the quiet of the house felt suffocating, and eventually, I needed to leave my room for something to drink. I stepped into the kitchen, hoping Jack wouldn't be there. But, of course, he was. He stood by the counter, pouring himself a glass of water. The second he saw me, his eyes locked onto mine. That look, it made my heart race. It wasn't just casual. It wasn't indifferent. It was something more. Something that made my pulse quicken and my breath hitch. "EMS," he said softly, like he was unsure whether to continue or stop right there. His voice was quiet, hesitant, but it carried the same weight as his gaze. I froze for a second, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could somehow ground me. "Jack, it's wrong," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I meant it or if I was trying to convince myself. I know, he admitted, taking a slow step closer. But that doesn't change anything, does it? I didn't move. I didn't step back, didn't run away like I probably should have. Instead, I stood there, caught between the logical part of my brain screaming at me to leave and the part that didn't want to. This isn't right, I repeated, though my voice lacked any real conviction. We can't. But do you want to stop? He asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. I opened my mouth to say yes, to end this once and for all. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't bring myself to lie, not to him, not to myself. And that silence was all the answer he needed. He took another step closer, closing the already small distance between us. I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. It made my head spin, clouding every rational thought I had left. We don't have to do anything, he said softly, his voice calm, steady. But we can't pretend this isn't real. I hated how much sense that made. I hated that he was right. This thing between us, whatever it was, wasn't something we could ignore anymore. It was there, pulling us together like gravity. And the more we tried to resist, the stronger it seemed to get. I don't know what to do, I whispered, finally admitting the truth. I don't know how to make it stop. Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. His hand brushed against mine, and that simple touch sent a jolt through me. It was electric, undeniable. I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to break free. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. I feel it too. Those words broke something inside me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. He felt it too, the same pull, the same confusion, the same forbidden desire. And in that moment, all the fear, all the doubt melted away, leaving only the raw truth of what we both felt. Without thinking, without planning, I closed the gap between us. Our hands touched first, fingers intertwining naturally, like it was something we'd done 100 times before. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in. Our lips met in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, but filled with all the unspoken emotions we'd been holding back for weeks. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was careful, almost tentative, like we were both afraid of crossing a line we couldn't uncross. When we finally pulled away, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, caught in the aftermath of something we couldn't undo. My heart was racing, my mind spinning, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel tense. I felt relieved. Like something that had been building between us had finally been released. But that relief didn't last long. Reality came crashing back, bringing with it all the doubts and fears I'd tried to push away. This can't happen again, I said, stepping back, trying to put some distance between us. It was a mistake. Jack didn't argue. He just watched me with that same calm, steady gaze that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. If that's what you want, he said simply. But you know it's not over. And he was right. Deep down, I knew it too. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something far more complicated. We stood only a few steps apart, but the space between us felt charged, like it was holding the weight of everything we hadn't said. The silence was thick, the air almost too heavy to breathe. Jack's eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse race, my mind scream at me to leave, to stop this before it went too far. I know this is wrong, he said quietly, his voice steady but low, almost like a confession. He took a step closer, and instinctively, I stepped back. My hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, as if it could anchor me somehow, but it didn't help. The room felt smaller, like it was closing in around us, pushing us closer together despite everything. Jack, don't, I whispered, though my voice lacked the firmness I wanted it to have. It was trembling, just like my hands, just like the storm of emotions inside me. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my shoulder, a touch so gentle yet so electric that it made my breath hitch. I'm not trying to hurt you, he said softly. But we can't keep pretending, EMS. That nickname again. Every time he said it, it chipped away at my resolve. No one called me that except for my mom. Coming from Jack, it felt too personal, too intimate. I should have pulled away, should have walked out of that room. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, torn between fear and something else I didn't want to admit. His fingers lingered on my shoulder, not pushing, just resting there, but it was enough to make my heart race. I felt trapped, not physically, but by the weight of what was happening, by the undeniable pull that had been growing between us for weeks. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that I should put an end to it now. But my body betrayed me, rooted in place, unwilling, or unable, to move away. I don't want this, I said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing. Even I didn't believe them. Because deep down, part of me did want this. Part of me had wanted it ever since that day in my room, even though I knew how dangerous it was. Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. He was just as conflicted, just as caught in this web of forbidden emotions as I was. Slowly, he leaned in, giving me every chance to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. I couldn't. Our lips met in a kiss that was soft at first, hesitant, like we were testing the waters, unsure of how far to go. But the hesitation didn't last long. The kiss deepened, and with it, all the tension that had been building between us exploded into something we couldn't control. I don't know how long we stood there, caught in that moment, but it felt like an eternity. When we finally pulled away, both of us were breathing heavily, the weight of what we'd just done settling over us like a thick fog. This can't happen, I said, my voice shaky, but there was no conviction behind the words. We both knew it was too late for that. We'd already crossed the line. Jack ran a hand through his hair, looking conflicted, but he didn't argue. He didn't try to justify what had just happened, didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just stood there, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I should go, I muttered, turning toward the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. I needed to get out of there, to clear my head before I did something even more reckless. But before I could take a step, Jack spoke again. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I stopped in my tracks, my back still turned to him. Did I regret it? I wanted to say yes, to convince both him and myself that it was a mistake, that it meant nothing. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't regret it, not entirely. And that scared me more than anything. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I left before he could say anything else, retreating to my room and shutting the door behind me. But even there, alone in the quiet of my room, I couldn't escape what had just happened. My lips still tingled from the kiss, my heart still raced from the adrenaline. And my mind? It was a mess. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed in my room, avoiding Jack as much as possible. But I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the kiss, about the way his touch had made me feel. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But that didn't make it any less real. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Mom's car pulling into the driveway. She was back earlier than expected. Panic set in as I realized that I'd have to face Jack again, have to pretend that nothing had happened, that everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. I stayed in my room as long as I could, only coming out when I was sure Mom was busy unpacking. Jack was in the kitchen, making coffee. He didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel the tension between us. It was still there, still just as strong as the night before. "Morning," I said quietly, grabbing a glass of water. "Morning," he replied, his voice calm, but I could hear the underlying tension in it. Neither of us said anything else. Mom walked in a few minutes later, breaking the silence with her usual chatter. She didn't notice anything strange. To her, everything was normal. But between Jack and me, nothing could ever be normal again. When it happened, I didn't even know how to process it. I lay there on the couch, my heart pounding so fast I could barely catch my breath. Jack sat next to me, silent and distant, like he was trying to make sense of what we had just done. The room felt too quiet, too heavy, as if it was holding on to the weight of our actions. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he was afraid of how I might respond. I nodded slowly, even though I wasn't sure if it was true. Was I okay? I didn't know. I couldn't tell if I regretted what had just happened or if I was too numb to feel anything at all. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. There was no going back now. And that terrified me. The rest of the night passed in silence. Neither of us spoke again. I eventually retreated to my room, locking the door behind me, as if that could somehow block out the chaos swirling in my mind. But it didn't. The memory of what happened replayed over and over, each time leaving me more confused. Did I want it? Did I regret it? I didn't know. What scared me the most was that part of me didn't feel sorry. Part of me wanted more. And that realization made my stomach twist in knots. By morning, I hadn't slept a second. I heard Mom's car pulling into the driveway earlier than expected. My heart sank. How was I supposed to act normal around her? How was I supposed to pretend like nothing had happened? I forced myself to get out of bed, to take a shower and calm down, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. When I finally went downstairs, Jack was already in the kitchen with Mom, acting like everything was fine. He glanced at me for a brief second, just long enough for me to catch the tension in his eyes, but quickly looked away before Mom could notice. "Morning, sweetie," Mom chirped, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Did you and Jack have a quiet night?" Quiet? That was one way to describe it. I forced a smile and mumbled something about going out later. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't sit at the same table as Jack and pretend like my world hadn't just flipped upside down. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid him as much as possible. Every time we were in the same room, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The tension between us was suffocating, but somehow Mom never noticed. She was busy, distracted, and completely unaware of the mess her new husband and I had created. But avoiding Jack didn't help. It only made things worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that night, about how it felt, about how much I hated that I didn't completely regret it. The more I tried to push those thoughts away, the stronger they became. And then, it happened again. It was late one evening. Mom had gone to bed early, and I was alone in the living room, trying to distract myself with a movie. I didn't even hear Jack come in until he was standing right behind me. My heart jumped into my throat. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but serious. I hesitated, not trusting myself to be alone with him. But something in his tone made it clear that this wasn't a conversation I could avoid forever. So, reluctantly, I nodded. He sat down next to me, keeping just enough distance to make it feel less threatening, but close enough that I could feel the weight of his presence. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted after a long silence. "I don't know how to make this go away." I didn't respond right away. What was there to say? I didn't know how to fix it either. I didn't even know if I wanted to. That was the worst part. I didn't want it to end. "We can't keep doing this," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow. "It's going to destroy everything." Jack nodded slowly, as if he knew I was right but didn't want to accept it. "But what if we can't stop?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure there was one. And that's how it ended, at least for now. I wish I could say that was the last time something happened between us, but it wasn't. The truth is, things only got more complicated from there. And if you think this story is crazy now, trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you be able to stop? Or would you fall deeper into something you knew was wrong? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious.